Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. It is Tuesday afternoon, April 28th, 2026, and there's a lot going on. I have not been as active as I would like to be because I've had various things to do, but I did get my taxes done like I promised I would in my last video. But in any case, unfortunately, I didn't have to pay any because my income is so low. Um, so I suppose that's a blessing of a sort. But in any case, what I want to talk about is the fact that I'm seeing a lot of talk about the kind of unraveling of the Trump administration and what the potential consequences of that are. And the events seem to be speeding up and intensifying. So the question I'm asking myself is Trump going to be America's Gorbachev? Let me back up a little bit here and give some context. In the following the World War II, the Soviet Union defeated the Nazis virtually single-handedly. They basically crushed 80% of the German and the German Allied forces, which included Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Italy. Basically the future states making up NATO, which are now NATO is reemerged as the same kind of rabid Russophobic ideology that dominated Europe during the 1930s and 1940s. Anyway, so here we are in the 2020s, and Russia is, emerging from a very difficult past. It had, as I say, it had defeated the Nazis in the 1940s, and remarkably, staged a remarkable recovery given the fact that it lost 15% of its population. 27 million people died in the Second World War, what they call the Great Patriotic War. Compare that with, and devastated their economy, devastated their factories, farms, and so on. A war fought on Russian soil. And the United States experienced, one relative pinprick at Pearl Harbor. They lost 3,000 people and a few battleships, but that was about it. And of course, they did lose, our country did lose roughly 450,000 people, something like that. But that's not 27 million people. So, but the Soviet Union bounced back. And by the 1970s, it was quite strong. It had got the first man in space, the first satellite, and they were giving the United States a real run for its money. But some things happened, and I would say due partly to Western. The Western did have a significant advantage over the Soviet Union in terms of its influence and its economic power. But the Soviet Union was doing pretty well during the 1970s. But some people argue that it had a period of stagnation. And then in the 1980s, Reagan came to power with the clear intent to bring down the Soviet Union. And so they used economic pressure and massive amounts of propaganda, anti-Russian propaganda, to bring down the Soviet Union. The classic method of the United States is to accuse their target of the crimes that the United States commits. So the United States accuses the Soviet Union of gross human rights violation while incinerating 200,000 innocent civilians in Japan, who were, they were subject to their own fascist government. And of course, the United States has invaded and bombed numerous countries. It has the largest prison population in the world, but it's the Soviet Union's got the human rights problems, right? So, and unfortunately, the Soviet leadership under Gorbachev, faced with some of these various pressures, and also I think he himself was, you might say, ideologically compromised. He tried to reform the Soviet system and instead ended up bringing it down. So the question that I have is that now the United States is been under significant pressure from all sides. It's losing its control over the narrative. It's losing its wars. They thought that they could bring down Russia through Ukraine. That hasn't worked out. They thought they could bring down Iran. That hasn't worked out. They thought they could bring down Vietnam and Afghanistan, and those didn't work out either. But the question is there? It seems like the stream of events are piling up and creating more and more difficulties. So is because of that, there's been even as back as 1980, I think it is, President Carter talked about a sense of malaise in the United States. This is a problem that has been going on for a long time in the United States, and the people who run the country and run the narrative have been covering that up fairly successfully, either through propaganda or, in the case of Obama, through sheer force in crushing Occupy Wall Street or these ICE raids and so on. But they somehow managed to keep a lid on this whole situation. But what I'm suggesting here in this video is that things are changing. So first, I'm going to give some background, and what I say is that people in the United States have been living in a dream world for a long, long time. I'm going back to George Carlin, who was a great comedian, going back several decades. He died, I think, in 2008. I say he died of a broken heart, actually, but he was an amazing comedian. And he said, speaking from the first Gulf War of 1991, another war started based on lies, by the way, babies being thrown out of incubators, total lie. And they took down Saddam Hussein. Why? Because of Operation Iraqi Liberation, otherwise known as OIL, oil. The United States wants to get control of the world's oil because it wants to keep control of the petrodollar. So George Carlin said, "We like war. We're a warlike people." And of course, people can say that they're against the war, but the U.S. has waged major wars since World War II without legal constitutional authorization and using various excuses and workarounds. So both parties are fully complicit, and yet the voters go along with it. So they're not serious about opposing wars. In Vietnam, they were serious about opposing that war. I was out on the street on several occasions, and along with a million other students of that age, of that time, and there were some mutinies in the military, and we really forced Nixon to bring an end to the war. There was tremendous opposition to it, and I'll get to the possible resurgence of those conditions later on. So as I say, both parties have been complicit in this. And then what happens is periodically the United States or Israel or some one of these nefarious actors has to give the American people a kind of a pep talk in the form of a terrorist act. So on September 11th, 3 buildings came down, two World Trade Center buildings 1 and 2, and also building 7 fell down despite not having been hit by an airplane. And somebody from the BBC announced that it fell down before it fell down. How do they do that? Miraculously. But in any case, following that event, there was an authorization in Congress to declare war on terror. And there was one person who spoke up against it, and I was very proud of her. Her name was Barbara Lee. She was the congressperson representing the city of Oakland in the Bay Area. I'm going to quote what she has to say here. She says, "Mr. Speaker and members, I rise today with a really very heavy heart, one that is filled with sorrow for the families and the loved ones who were killed and injured this week. Only the most foolish and the most callous would not understand the grief that has really gripped our people and millions around the world. This unspeakable act on the United States has really forced me, however, to rely on my moral compass." Thank God she had a moral compass. "My conscience and my God for direction. September 11th change the world. Our deepest fears now haunt us, yet I am convinced that military action will not prevent further acts of international terrorism against the United States. This is a very complex and complicated matter. Now, this resolution will pass, even although we all know that the president can wage a war even without it, because they break the law. The Constitution says that we cannot wage a war without Congress authorizing a war. And yet the president has slowly but surely acquired that power and has been doing this for decades. So she says the president can wage a war even without congressional authorization. And however difficult this vote may be, some of us must urge the use of restraint. Our country is in a state of mourning. Some of us must say, let's step back a bit for a moment. Let's just pause for a minute and think things through. The implications of our actions today so that it does not spiral out of control like it's out of control now, 25 years later. She goes on to say, now I have agonized over this vote, but I came to grips with it today, and I came to grips with opposing this resolution during the very painful yet beautiful memorial service as a member of the clergy so elegantly said, as we act, let us not become the evil we deplore. That was her quote. Back to me. A few of us had deep suspicions. I personally had very deep suspicions about who was actually behind those attacks. But of course, we were consigned to be conspiracy theorists. And 20 years earlier, George Carlin even warned us about this. In 1991, he was warning about being manipulated. Now, later on, Reverend Wright, who was an African-American pastor in Chicago, and he had been the pastor for Obama. Obama was playing a cool guy from the hood, so to speak, and he attended Reverend Wright's sermons at this church. It was primarily an African-American church. But when Reverend Wright posted a couple of sermons where he talked about the chickens are coming home to roost, speaking of American terrorism coming back on us, he was basically summarily fired by Obama, because Obama was a servant of the empire, not a servant of Wright's God. Let's put it that way. Now, recently, I wrote a letter to my local congressperson here, just to show you, just to give you an example of how far down the rabbit hole we have gone here. And these are the people who are leading our country, making laws. So here's a letter. Here's a response I received from my local congressman following a letter I wrote warning him about the false narrative of Iranian nuclear weapons. I wrote him a letter saying that Iran has been accused of being weeks away from nuclear weapons for 30 years. And they've insisted that they don't want nuclear weapons. They think there's a way around, way to defend themselves without the need for nuclear weapons. There's been religious edicts against creating a nuclear weapon. So there's all this evidence that even the U.S. intelligence estimate says there's no evidence that Iran is trying to acquire nuclear weapons. And yet this narrative is so powerful in Washington that this is the kind of letter that I got. He says, as you may know, Congressional Resolution 38 was introduced on June 17, 2025 by Representative Thomas Massie. The concurrent resolution would direct the president to terminate the use of U.S. armed force against Iran or any part of the Iranian government or military unless there's a formal declaration of war or authorization to use military forces. And Thomas Massie, one of the few sane people in Congress. libertarian, which I have my issues with libertarianism, but he's got it right in terms of the facts here. So here is what, so his response to this letter advocating restraint against a war, he says, this is my congressman saying, it has long been the policy of the United States. This is very important. It has long been the policy of the United States through Democrat and Republican administrations. They're complicit in warmongering, both of them. That's my editorial comment. That the Iranian regime must never obtain a nuclear weapon. They've never wanted to get a nuclear weapon, you stupid congressperson. Why do you keep making that accusation when it's flatly untrue? The regime's pursuit of nuclear capabilities, yes, under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, they do have the right to enrich nuclear materials. Alongside its sponsorship of terrorism, which means if you oppose Israel's genocide, that makes you a terrorist. And destabilizing activities, what, like bombing Lebanon to shreds and bombing Gaza, destroying hundreds of thousands of lives, virtually all of its buildings, its universities, its hospitals, and Iran is the one who's destabilizing the situation. You see, this is the kind of mental attitude that infects the political class in Washington. I continue. The regime's pursuit of nuclear capabilities, along with its sponsorship of terrorism and destabilizing activities across the region, poses a serious threat to American interests. What interests? The oil companies' interests, the bankers' interests? Whose interests are we talking about? They're not my interests. Whose interests are we talking about? The Israeli lobby's interests, maybe. They say American interest. Oh, that's us. No, it's not us. In a recent interview, I noted the importance of keeping Congress informed and involved as events unfold, yet misinformed more likely, so that we can help define and pursue U.S. objectives, like regime change and destroying a country, wiping it off the map, sending it back to the Stone Age. That's our U.S. objective. I will continue to monitor developments closely and keep your views in mind during future congressional action. So this is an example of somebody who is deeply compromised, a part of the political class. I would call him a political hack. I won't mention the name because I just don't want to go there, but the Congress is just filled with these people. They're on the take. They're all political hacks. They're opportunists. They wage war. They allow millions of people to die and suffer for their careerist ambitions. It's just, this is outrageous. He says, I say it's extremely unfortunate that for apparent political reasons, this fellow is literally, he's like a brainless parrot, parroting the party line, despite 30 years of Iran refusing to create nuclear weapons, just as Israel cries wolf about Iran only weeks away from doing so. And despite 80 years of Israeli destabilizing and indeed being the major terrorist in the Middle East, West Asia, the Zionists can say whatever they want. But this is why it's so important to do the digging and go and get historical context. So here is what preeminent Jewish authorities said in a December 1948 letter to the New York Times. This is a link from the New York Times in the New York Times archives. Einstein's statement assails Begin's party. Menachem Begin was a terrorist who became the prime minister of Israel. Here's a quote. Dr. Albert Einstein, Professor Sidney Hook, and 19 other scholars and teachers joined yesterday in a public statement denouncing the quote-unquote Freedom Party of Israel led by Menachem Begin. I might mention that there's a fascist party in Ukraine also called the Svoboda Party, which means Freedom Party. And you wonder, why these two, regimes that thrive on racial supremacy. It's either Jewish Zionist supremacy or Ukrainian racial supremacy. They share the same ideology. And it said Menachem Begin, who is now visiting in the United States, as one that until recently openly, this is a group of Jewish scholars and leading intellectuals. He says, they openly preach the doctrine of the fascist state. This is 1948, they're talking about this. At the same time, Nahum Gutman, a spokesman for the American Trade Union Council for Histadrut, which is a Zionist labor organization, announced that Philip Murray, president of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, that the CIO, that's an American labor organization, had informed the council that he had not authorized the use of his name as a member of the reception committee of 1000 for Mr. Begin. In the statement signed by Drs. Einstein, Hook, and others, Mr. Begin and his followers were denounced as terrorists who exacted a heavy tribute from the population and whose goal was a leader state. Within the Jewish community, they have preached an admixture of ultranationalism, religious mysticism, and racial superiority, the statement asserted. Like other fascist parties, they have been used to break strikes and have themselves pressed for the destruction of free trade unions. In their stead, they have proposed corporate unions on the Italian fascist model. This is written in 1948. So if you're wondering why things are the way they are, the roots go back way, way, way back. Now, the other problem that we have, that is now, this is where we're getting into coming up to current events. President Trump has a conflict with NATO, supposedly. He says that, NATO is not doing its share. Well, what Trump is saying is that U.S. power has declined, relatively speaking, and rather than being able to pursue these wars worldwide, it's asking for some help from its allies, so to speak, the Europeans. And so he's basically trying to shame NATO into fighting its wars for it, which NATO seems willing to do, actually. Now, the problem with Trump is that he's broken many, many promises and has only made matters worse. So now we're getting into the heart of this article. And I say, will Donald Trump be America's Gorbachev? The pressures are building. When Mikhail Gorbachev took over the Soviet Union, he promised reform, otherwise known as perestroika, and transparency, otherwise known as glasnost. Instead, the empire, that is the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, unraveled. Now, a growing number of political analysts are asking an uncomfortable question. Is Donald Trump America's Gorbachev? Donald Trump promised to make America great again, going back to its imperialist glory days after World War II. He is going to make America great again by avoiding new wars, bringing transparency, and reducing debt. But based on roughly 20 data points from his recent terms, pressures are not easing, they are accelerating. Let me enumerate. Broken promises. No new wars. Trump illegally initiated a war on Iran that is failing. He says every day, we're winning, and yet they're not winning. It's quite clear they're not winning. In fact, he was just snubbed. He thought that Iran was going to Pakistan to negotiate with his three stooges, Witkoff, Kushner, and Vance, and Iran's foreign minister said, we didn't go to Pakistan to talk with you. We came to Pakistan to deliver a message that they're going to deliver to you, but we're not going to talk to you because you're unreliable. We don't trust you. So that was no new wars. Kidnapping a foreign leader. He attacked and kidnapped Venezuelan leader Maduro, violating domestic and international law. He never got any authorization to do that. He never got any authorization to kill fishermen and boats off the coast of Venezuela. Everything he's been doing is illegal according to both international and domestic law, and yet he got away with it. And although he did manage to kidnap Venezuela's president, it's unclear, just how much control he has over the country, because the acting president says that yes, Trump, very good, we'll cooperate, but it doesn't. It's questionable, according to economist Radhika Desai and some of her guests, that Venezuela is not subdued, and they're not going to put up with becoming a colony again. So we'll have to see how that works out. Regarding the Ukraine war, Trump promised to end the war on day one. Instead, the U.S. continues aiding the Kiev regime with intelligence and planning. Trump promised transparency. JFK files and Epstein files remain largely sealed, despite promises of full disclosure. Then we have the case of geopolitical failures. We have the abandoning of Gulf allies. Trump failed to protect the Gulf Arab partners when weakening a critical U.S. coalition. So Trump starts this war with Israel against Iran, and when Iran said openly, if you guys attack us, we're going to bomb your bases on wherever we can find them in our neighborhood, and that's exactly what they did, and they've caused tremendous problems for the Gulf Arab states, who are basically imperialist puppets anyway. Another issue is that there's no goodwill towards Russia. Despite talks in Anchorage, Putin, nothing came of it. Russia's $300 billion, which was essentially stolen from Russian offshore bank accounts, remains frozen. Sanctions are untouched. Diplomatic properties are not returned, and there's no direct flights. So there's been there's been a lot of talk about, rapprochement with Russia, but there's been not a single instance where they've done something to really, follow through on any of that. Commodity chaos. Disruptions in gas, oil, fertilizer, and helium are fueling starvation, inflation, and stagnation. Stagflation. Stagflation is when the economy is in a state of recession, or it's very slow, but inflation is rising. So you have rising costs, lowering incomes, and that causes tremendous economic and social stress. We have we're heading towards economic suicide. So the U.S. faces a $39 trillion debt, something in that neighborhood, and yet instead of dealing with the debt crisis, Trump just decides to increase the military budget by $500 billion. It's a 50% increase, which is unheard of in the history of U.S. Budget planning. You had the case of Doge. He says, we're going to save money using Elon Musk's new agency. And Doge saved $200 billion, but then they used that to finance the war in Iran. So there was no savings. Then we have the case of market manipulation, where there's strong evidence that shows that Trump says something, the market goes up or goes down, and his cronies are placing insider trades based on the fact they know what's going to be said. They place a trade either, expecting the market to go up or expecting the market to go down, and they're making, millions or maybe even billions of dollars playing the market. This is totally illegal, and yet they're getting away with it. Then we have the problem of domestic erosion. There's talk of the draft being reenacted. So new legislation automatically registers men for the draft. But young men are resisting, justifiably, and analysts predict Vietnam scale protests. So these wars are very unpopular, and yet the government, decides that they're going to reinstitute the draft so that they can get their cannon fodder. But we've been through that already. And the reason why there is no draft at this point is because of mass resistance. And from what we can see, the young people of this country, they may be acquiescent to these wars, but they're damn certain they don't want to fight them, except for a few people who are in the poverty draft who have no prospects of anything else. Then, of course, you have the ICE protests, which turn violent. And major protests over ICE policies have left 2 white Americans dead, alongside ongoing persecution of non-whites and many deaths of those people, too. Then we have the situation of gutting the State Department. So Trump requested $12.32 billion for State Department operations, a 28.1% cut. Congress pushed back, but diplomacy is still severely underfunded. We have another case of breaking the Forest Service. So the administration plans to dismantle the National Forest Service, firing decades of experienced professionals. So what we're seeing is a systematic dismantling of the U.S. government efficacy and systematic increase in alienation of the population. Moving on here, looking at the cabinet, the chaotic cabinet. Who did Trump hire to be the Secretary of War? Pete Hegseth. He's a news anchor with no relevant experience, and he's been described as religiously fanatical and severely unqualified. He has the people he's hiring as envoys are not career diplomats. These people like not Pete Hegseth, but Jared Kushner, a real estate guy, Witkoff, a real estate guy, and J.D. Vance, who is a politician. But these people are not trained. They do not have deep training in diplomacy and history and the kinds of background that you need in order to engage in serious negotiations. At the recent negotiations in Iran, they sent Vance and Witkoff and Jared Kushner. The Iranians brought a delegation of like 70 people. These are all experts in various aspects of nuclear energy, nuclear issues, and other relevant issues. The United States, they're not serious. They're not qualified. They're not serious, and frankly, they're not even very intelligent. So then there's the question of the empire. What's to become of the U.S. empire? Is it who controls the empire? Is it Israel that's controlling the empire, or is it the United States using Israel as a vector to further the aims of the United States? You could call it an unholy alliance. You can say one is controlling the other. It doesn't really matter. The reality is that it's causing more and more problems. Then we have the situation of the petrodollar decline. Because the United States failed in its efforts to bring Iran to heel, what's happened has been that Iran has taken control of the Hormuz Strait, which they promised they would do. The United States thought they could get away with destroying Iran. That didn't work, and instead, now Iran has control of the strait, and the United States, we're blockading the ships, but they're not effectively enforcing that blockade. In fact, there's a case where the United States did board a particular tanker, and the Iranians boarded a couple more tankers, and now the United States is saying, well, maybe we better not. They're realizing they're seriously overextended. Of course, you also have the case of the supremely unqualified Secretary of the Navy, who is, again, he was just a political appointee. He has no experience in naval affairs, and yet Trump sticks him in there and when it doesn't work out, they fire him. So this is an administration that's in complete disarray, and the people who are in that administration are incompetent and probably not terribly bright either, and probably not even mentally balanced for that matter. So as a result of this, Iran is saying, yeah, we will let ships go through the Hormuz Strait, but you're going to have to pay us in Chinese yuan or Iranian rial. So that means that the dollar is facing a decline. And now we're hearing reports that the Arab states are asking for currency swaps. Well, what's all that about? That's because there's a chance that there could be a kind of like a run on the dollar. They've lost their source of income from their sales of oil, but they have their expenses. So as a result, there's going to be a problem with the dollar itself, and that puts extra strain on international interest rates. If interest rates go up, that makes it more difficult for the United States to maintain its unsupportable $39 trillion debt, and you can see where this is all going. Going on further here, Congress has rejected some of the deepest cuts. So while Congress restored some diplomacy funding to $50 billion, still below prior levels, the administration's intent to cut 83.7% of international programs. So basically, the United States thought that it was going to maintain hegemony, but instead it's actually isolating itself. And finally, I'll say there's no end in sight. From Iran to Venezuela, Ukraine to the draft, every problem Trump promised to solve has worsened, and he's created problems that didn't even exist. So, in conclusion, is this a Gorbachev in reverse? Gorbachev tried to save the USSR, the Soviet Union, but instead presided over its collapse. Trump promised to save America, but the data shows he is systematically weakening alliances with the European allies, or he's bullying countries to militarize, such as the case of Japan, which is causing tensions there. But he's in effect he's weakening alliances around the world, and he's destroying our diplomatic capacity. He's escalating wars. He's bankrupting the Treasury. So, question is, will he turn out to be Gorbachev, America's Gorbachev? The pressures that he is exerting on the U.S. political system, the economic system, are so intense that I've been asking myself, how long can this go on? And I'm not the only one who's been asking that question, but I think it's very important. I recently had a discussion with two AI engines about this question. They say, no, the U.S. political system is quite stable. Our economic system is quite stable. Our dollar is quite stable. Everything's going to be just fine. We've had difficulties before, but we've always gotten through this. And but I'm not buying it. I think that the problems that we're facing are intensifying, and the quality of the people who are running the government is so poor that I just cannot see a good ending to this, because essentially the political class, as exemplified by that letter that I got from my own congressperson, completely ignorant, willfully ignorant of the realities of our foreign affairs with Iran. The whole political class is like that. You cannot exist in a fantasy world, think that you're going to maintain control of that world without the reality biting you back. So that's the question. So as I say, pressures are building, and Trump has only exacerbated the problems. So my question to you is, do you think that Trump is accelerating the decline of, or saving the American empire? So please share your thoughts and comments below. I'd really like to hear what you have to say, because we need to open up this discussion, and decide what is going on here. And I also, it's important to point out, as was mentioned earlier, that people are talking about, the Republicans are going to get wiped out in the autumn elections, but both parties are complicit in our problem. So it's the system that we have to go after. And just in closing, I'll mention that I think it was Larry Johnson, who's is an excellent commentator. He said that the problem is these forever wars, and I forgot the other term that he used as far as the chaos at home. I think he said chaos at home. I say no. What we're dealing with here is endless wars abroad and class war at home. It all comes down to class. The billionaires, they wage the wars. The bankers wage the wars. They drag us into all this stuff, and it's up to us to pull ourselves together and put a stop to this madness before we all go up in a nuclear cloud. So thanks again for listening. Again, please support my channel by giving me a like or a share, or make a donation to my Substack, or get one of my information billboard T-shirts like this, which is this question everything. So I hope I'm encouraging all of you to question everything, and I look forward to talking with you again in the next video.